Hello everybody, can I ask you to take your seat and we'll get started? Does that affect it?
So maybe when I'm about 20 minutes in, if you just say lead 20 minutes, just because then I know I'm about.
Okay.
Or yeah, because then yeah, because that'll help me just in pacing.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll tell you when you're 20 minutes in. Is everybody here? Good morning, everybody. And can I invite you all to take your seats? And as we're waiting for everybody to take their seats, can I ask you to turn off your phones or turn them on to silent or whatever it is that you need to do to avoid any interruptions for the day, and to take note of your nearest fire exits. I can see 3 in the room and there's probably some more behind the stage. So we're well equipped, I think, if in the case of a fire, and I don't think there's any scheduled fire alarms for this morning. So, my name is Teresa Heaney, and I'm going to be your chair this morning for the first day of the Children's Rights Alliance End school-age care sector here in Ireland, and our work focuses on our dual objectives of achieving a high-quality early years system and high-quality early years settings so that children will flourish in those settings. End Child Poverty Week, as you know, places a spotlight on child poverty in Ireland and what can be done to break the cycle of poverty for children and young people. And the theme of today's event is early childhood education and care. Before we jump into the programme, I'd like to thank our hosts for the day, the YMCA, and I'm sure that lots of you had an enjoyable time walking up the stairs and having a look around this fantastic centre. The YMCA runs a fantastic early years service from this building, so good that it was chosen as the location to launch Equal Start, and it always has a waiting list. Mind you, a lot of us know that a lot of services always have waiting lists. So some of you may have read about the service and its impact in the recent Children's Rights Alliance Child Poverty Monitor. It provides a critical resource to support the well-being of young children growing up in the heart of the city, and for all of those reasons, it's a real privilege to be here today. As we all know, the impact of experiencing poverty is not the same for everyone. To experience poverty as a baby or a young child can have a devastating effect and impact on children's health, development and education, and critically, their self-concept and sense of belonging. It is therefore an uphill battle to undo the harm that is caused by experiencing deprivation in those critical early years. It has been proven beyond a doubt that one of the most effective measures that a government can make is to invest in early years care and education. It can change the fortunes of a nation's children. It is really that simple. It can break the cycle of intergenerational poverty and trauma for children and their families. So, knowing that, the Children's Rights Alliance is calling for the government in Budget 26 to allocate an additional €50 million in funding in the budget to continue to build momentum around the implementation of Equal Start. And we will hear more about Equal Start later this morning. We have an exciting lineup for the event this morning. First, we will hear from Professor Lee Elliott Major, and there's not to be any jokes about him being anything akin to the $6 million man. I will then invite our panel to the top table, and I'll introduce all of the speakers to you then. There will be a Q&A at the end where we will have an opportunity to raise questions with our panel here today. And Lee is going to take a couple of questions immediately after his own presentation. The Children's Rights Alliance team will be sharing information throughout the event on social media, and we encourage you to add your voice to the discussion online by using the hashtags End Child Poverty Week and hashtag Children's Budget. We want to bring as much attention to this discussion today and add as many voices and yours voices if possible, so that we can make Budget 26 a children's budget. So that's the kick-off, and so now we're going to move on to our keynote address. And I'm going to introduce you to Lee. We're delighted to have Professor Lee Elliott-Major to provide a keynote to kick off today's End Child Poverty Week. Lee is Britain's first Professor of Social Mobility based at the University of Exeter. He's an OBE and a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. He advises government, education and corporate leaders around the world on enabling people from all socioeconomic backgrounds to flourish in life, whatever path they choose. He was formerly CEO of the Sutton Trust, the UK's leading social mobility foundation. His award-winning books include Social Mobility and Its Enemies and Equity in Education. Lee lived on his own from the age of 15 and once worked as a bin man and was first in his family to go to university. He was awarded an OBE for his services to social mobility. So I'm very pleased to introduce Lee, and we're looking forward to the presentation.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm getting rising imposter syndrome with that introduction. I always think, are you talking about someone else when you list those achievements? And I am going to talk a little bit about my own story in this presentation. It's quite an ambitious presentation, this, because I'm going to try and give you an international perspective on some of the issues that we're all interested in. And it's very big picture, okay? It's going to look at different countries, it's going to look at generational trends, international trends, but hopefully something to reflect on from an Irish perspective. Also, I have to tell you, I have an Irish connection. I'm married to a Kerry woman. I'm always a bit nervous coming to Dublin as an Englishman, particularly when I'm giving talks. And I remember giving a talk at Trinity a few years back, and I said, you know, I'm nervous being English. And then when I mentioned that I was an honorary Kerry man, the whole audience started hissing. It was quite an interesting experience. And I hadn't realised that there was such a competitive thing on the football, isn't it? It's the Gaelic football. So anyway, I am a proud Kerry man. And I was just saying, my children have Irish passports. I still have to go into the non-EU queue when I come here to Dublin, which frustrates me. And it was also, I have to say, an Irish family that took me in, that helped me and I'll talk a bit about my story in London. And Siobhan's family, my partner, has been the family that's helped me in many ways. So we'll come back to that. I use this metaphor of an unlevel playing field. It was an Australian who actually gave me this image, a very nice man who, and I use it a lot because a lot of my work uses the metaphor of the game, okay, playing the game, and I believe we have a rigged game in this world, okay, and I'll talk a little bit about that, and it is about poverty, it is about material poverty, and I'm going to show you some stark statistics of how poverty is increasing in the world in many ways, but it's also about cultural divide, so I talk a lot about class. I believe there is a class system in Ireland. I think it is, Liz and I were talking about this, I think it's probably more subtle than it is in Britain, the home of the class divides, as you all know. But my contention is that a lot of the inequities that we see in society are both material and cultural, okay? We'll come back to that. So just think of that, keep that in mind, that the idea of the game, because I'll keep coming back to that. This is a bit like facing the Irish rugby team, if you're facing them, right? Right, so my story, and I'm honestly, my friends always say, Lee, your story gets bigger every time you tell this story. So I won't bore you for the whole half an hour on this, but it is important, partly because this is a personal thing for me as well as a professional thing. This is quite unusual in England. Like, there are not many professors who come from my sort of background, and I still feel like a bit of an alien in a very middle-class world, I have to be honest with you. But this has become, I did a presentation in America, and one of the people before I spoke said, Lee, you should tell your own story, and it was that actually made me do it, and they were so very American about it. They all gave me a rousing applause. And then I've started using it, and where I was a bit maybe maybe ashamed of some of my background. Now I use it very much to distinguish me, actually, in many ways in this field. I don't know if people are old enough here or remember a band called Curiosity Killed the Cat. Does anyone remember it? So the lead singer looked a bit like that. Can I just say I had that hat before him, right? So I wasn't, and it was my Che Guevara hat. I was trying to look like Che Guevara at the time. But the reason I share those images is when I do lectures with trainee teachers, with undergraduates, is just to give them a sense that I wasn't always this old, sort of slightly middle-aged man, that there was a different me, and that actually your background shouldn't necessarily determine what you do in life, right? Yeah, lots of stories about the way I look, and I always get lots of comments about the punk hairstyle as well. I was actually, it wasn't strictly a punk, actually, it was new wave, okay? We can talk about this later, but it was early 80s. But I wore eyeliner, had earrings, all that sort of stuff. Now, the story there is a Daily Mail article. Now, for those of you who don't know Daily Mail, it's quite a right-leaning paper in Britain. It's very popular still. And when you get rung up by the Daily Mail the night before, you're scared. And I got this experience. I thought, what have they found out about me, you know? And actually, what they wanted to do was this story about me, right? And they'd found out that I was a bin man when I was younger. Now, the truth of this story is my mum worked for the local council. It was nepotism, right? She got me that job. It was for a summer. I was doing a PhD in theoretical physics at the time, right? So when did you know, facts get in the way of a good story? So I did do the bins. I was a street cleaner, and I'm very proud of that. But they did this is a classic British story in the media you'll see of social mobility. You know, someone from a poor background who kind of makes it, right? And I was, as Teresa was saying, you know, I left home at 15. My mum and dad split up. I was basically homeless at 15. I dropped out of school. So there was a lot of challenges for me. But the point of my work is that background shouldn't determine what you do, whatever it is you choose to do in life, right? So I always say to students, and it's lovely when I present to primary school pupils, because someone always puts their hand up and says, Lee, how do you become a bin man, right? And I think this is a really good question, because we should value people whatever they do in society. And one of the worries I have with a lot of the debates we have in this area is that we fall into what I call deficit approaches, right? So we judge certain people to be successful and not others. And a lot of my work with teacher leaders, and I've done some work with Irish teacher leaders as well, is around how do we value those children in your school that will go on to do valuable local jobs. I don't think we pay those people enough, by the way, teachers, social workers, bin men, etc. But we should value those outcomes as much as the academic people like me that go on to become professors. It might seem an obvious point to all of you in here, but honestly, I feel like we do fall into deficit approaches in many countries in the way that we think about success. And it really relates to what a lot of academics in my field would call the myth of meritocracy, right? That we are all functions, our outcomes are only functions of how hard we work, how talented we are, and they don't mention the systematic inequities that we face in society. So a lot of my work is trying to remind politicians and governments that there are these big inequities in the world. So beware the deficit approach. I also think we belittle those people from, I would call it working class backgrounds in England. So I would argue my adversity gave me strength that meant I was resilient. I'm quite quick thinking. There are things that people bring with them when they come from diverse backgrounds, and we need to celebrate that as much as the other things. I would argue the middle class notion of self-advocacy is actually very individualistic in its nature. Sorry, I don't want to go off on class. Maybe we can have some questions on this, but I'll be very interested in observations from an Irish perspective, because it might be slightly different to that from a British perspective. So that's my story, lots more to it. The other thing I'd say about this story is it is individualistic. My view is we don't value people who give back to the common good. My partner Siobhan is a classic Irish story. She happens to be a nurse. She now runs an eye centre in London. Siobhan does things for people, not because it's a transaction, not because of a sort of Trumpian notion that you're going to get back something from that. She just does it because she wants to help people. I know that sounds very idealistic, but most teachers, social workers, nurses do it for the good of humankind, and I don't think we value that enough. Right. Now, I'm going to give you some interesting, hopefully some data on some of the world trends in this area. That's me. I've already spoken a lot about me. Various books I've written over the years. I was saying to Liz, my real speciality is translating research into something that's readable, accessible, that actually impacts on actions in the world. I'm a professor of practice. It's very unusual in England, but I've written various books. I work a lot in education, but also kind of broader social policy. Anyway, they're all available in good bookstores, I think, online, and I'm madly trying to write the cracking the global class codes at the moment. We're actually looking at countries like India and China and things like this. It's fascinating, and I think some of the things I'm going to talk about are actually global, universal issues. So the global trends, and I will share these slides with everyone. There's a lot of interesting data in here, and sorry, there's probably a bit too, I got a bit excited with all these data I wanted to show you. But I just wanted to give you a sense of some of the generational global trends that we're facing. This is a very famous graph in my area. By the way, social mobility, the reason we study social mobility is that we're looking at the origins of people and then where they end up in adulthood, okay? And the reason we're interested in that is for the notion of equality of opportunity, because the weaker the link between origins and outcomes, the more mobile we are as a society. I'll come back to this term, because really my work is more around social justice or a social reset, but that's kind of what we mean by social mobility. This graph looks at two things for countries. There's all sorts of caveats to this graph and ifs and buts, but essentially the bottom line is the Gini coefficient. That's how unequal the countries are in terms of incomes, the rich and poor, if you like, the gap between the rich and poor. And then the y-axis is the intergenerational elasticity. It's basically the persistence. How much is your outcomes related to your parents' characteristics? Okay, so if your mother and father earned so much, does that predict your earnings in your adult life? And the basic trend here, the basic pattern is that the Brits and the Americans, for all the talk of the American dream, are on the worst bit of this graph, okay? We are the most unequal nations, but also there's the strongest link to your family background and your outcomes. So the American dream is a bit of a myth. If there's any dream, it's probably the Scandinavian dream, to be honest with you, if we're looking at these things. Now, I put Ireland in, right? And again, this is just not a study here. I've just literally did it last week, so just to see where you stood. And you'd have to check some of the data, but that was the data I could find. And on the plus side, you're not as unequal as Britain yet, although I suspect you might be moving towards the Anglo-American scale. But I think on the challenge side, I would say to you is that given your inequality, you still seem to have very high persistence between families. And we'll come back to that, because some of the studies would suggest that there is quite a high persistence of poverty in Ireland and also of privilege at the very top, but we'll come back to that. So this is just something to think about. What we're basically saying is if you have an unequal start, then it's going to affect life prospects of people in your country. So a lot of my work is really about how do we improve origins so that people have a better life prospects, whatever it is they choose to do in life. The other big trend that we're seeing in the data is that the golden era, and again, Liz and I were talking about this, we're both products of this. I was mobile, right? I did better than my parents on certain measures. They didn't go to university, I went to university, I became a professor, etc., etc. But what we're finding, and this graph to the left is for the UK, the blue lines is the measures for each cohort, for each generation we're looking at, successive generations from the 1950s all the way to the 1980s, people born in the 1980s. Even though people like me weren't getting into the top echelons of society, we were doing slightly better than our parents, all right? That's what we mean by absolute social mobility. The red line is levels of downward mobility. That means you're doing slightly less well than your parents. We measure on earnings, class, whether you can get a house, all these sorts of measures. And the thing about what happened after the 1980s for people born is that for the first time, we are seeing higher levels of downward mobility. It's a really, I think, a profound change in society. And a lot of my work is, of course, about those that come from the most disadvantaged backgrounds. But what we're finding in the data, there are many people in middle income brackets now who are also struggling to lead what I would call a decent life. We see this, by the way, with teachers in London and places like that in England, just struggling to get onto the housing ladder. I'll be very interested to know what the debates are here around housing. Housing is something that comes up time and time again, by the way. I'm an educationalist, but I would say that the house you live in, and whether that is a permanent house, address, is profoundly influential on your outcomes in life. This is something that we're finding more and more in the studies. That's just the American dream. Half of people aren't earning more than their parents did from the 1980s. As I said, it's not really the land of the American dream anymore for most people. So this is just another report that I dug out because there were some references to Ireland. You are beating the UK on this measure, which you should be very proud of, but there are challenges, as I said. So this is from the World Bank from a few years ago. As I said, it was interesting looking at that report, and I'm not an expert on Ireland, but I was just picking out some of the things that was mentioned in that report. But what surprised me, I have to say, was that they were arguing that in Ireland there is this persistence of privilege and poverty. I call it privilege at the top. So that's basically your mum and dad's income or social class is quite predictive of those things at the extremes. And on this measure, I think this was losing income, that in Ireland 24% of people were downwardly mobile in the absolute sense. So there's some real challenges there, I would say, for Ireland. This is from England. I don't have the Irish data on it, but one of the frustrations I have in England, and there's a lack of public debate on this, is that our country is becoming poorer. This is just free school meals, okay, in England. So when schools get a bit of extra money for children who are on free school meals, there's a lot of debate about this. And basically, the proportion is going up. About 25% now of children are on free school meals in England. This is primary and secondary schools. By the way, there's a huge amount of children that are facing poverty outside of this group that we're finding. I do a lot of work in the southwest of England. We see lots of rural and coastal poverty. Again, I suspect there'll be similar things in Ireland. But anyway, it's on the increase, and we're seeing this in many, many countries. This is, I'm sorry, I know I'm bombarding you with data here. This is an interesting graph from America, one of the few studies that's looked at wealth. And what the reason I'm showing you this is that what we're finding here is that the millennials, those born around the millennium, basically the wealth is accruing more to those at the top of the income spectrum. Not only this, and this, by the way, wealth includes housing as well, among other assets, but in America, those on the bottom percentiles are actually getting less wealthy, poorer, basically. So you're seeing these extremes, and this is a generational trend, and we're seeing it across a range of countries. I couldn't resist this question, right, for you all coming outside of the UK, and see if you know the answer to this question. How many universities have produced English prime ministers since the war, do you think? Any idea? 5, 2, it's 1, okay? It's Oxford. And hasn't Oxford produced some very strange people over the last 50 years? But I just wanted to give you a flavour of this, because you do see it in other countries. But I think the problem we have in Britain is that we have, even in the current cabinet, which is a bit more diverse, I have to say, than previous cabinets, I would argue that we have an increasingly detached political elite in our country. And if you do have that, they are less understanding and empathetic of people that come from poorer backgrounds, okay? So lots of things I could say about that. I know the histories of all of them and written articles about it, but I believe that your background does inform your decisions as a politician, right? I'm not saying we don't have anyone from those backgrounds, but if they're dominated from people from those backgrounds, I think that's not good for policy. So in the book, we are trying to capture what modern sort of class divides look like, because class is always evolving, right? As a concept. And this is our attempt, this is all work in progress, by the way, still writing the book, to give a sort of sense of what the different groupings are. I'm sorry, it's a bit depressing, this as well, but we're looking at different countries across the world. And from what we can tell, the data showing us is that we're emerging, I suppose, into a new class divide. And there are 3 groups. The dispossessed, we call it, I mean, you could call it the poor, but we use that because, again, we think that wealth is becoming a bigger factor in determining life prospects. So whether you live in a house, whether it's owned, is so profoundly influential now. Geography is becoming influential, and as with England being dominated by London, again, I'll be very interested in people's views about Dublin and Ireland. From what I can tell, there's an agglomeration, we would call in the academic literature, of opportunities in Dublin. So a big challenge for many countries is how do you have a genuine regional strategy around opportunity, and I'll be very interested to hear about that in Ireland. Even though Ireland's a small country, when you look at the opportunities, it tends to be very much focused around Dublin. Education, and I can show you some slides, is not acting as the great social leveller we would all like it to be, and that's partly because it's counterbalancing the inequalities that I'm speaking about. Of course, teachers do an amazing job, but in my view, you have to work inside and outside the school gates if you're going to have a chance to create genuinely opportunity societies. Cultural codes, I hope we can talk a little bit about this if we get time, but I'm obsessed with this because in England, the school system, the university system has an assumption, okay, that you are middle class in your nature. So if you're used to advocating for yourself, I've had to learn this, by the way, I wasn't always like this. I had an accent that sounds a bit like early David Beckham, although David Beckham's changed his accent, by the way. So I used to talk a bit more like a Cockney. My brother says I sound like Tony Blair now. It's really interesting. And it's because I have adapted my accent. I'll be very interested to hear if this is the same in Ireland. But certainly in England, if you become part of the middle classes as you grow up, you kind of, people like me have almost changed subconsciously. I sometimes get people in the audience saying, Lee, why did you change your accent? I say, I don't know. I didn't mean to. It didn't happen. By the way, when Siobhan comes back to Kerry, she becomes much stronger in her accent, which is always kind of interesting. So accents is one of those cultural codes, but it's not just about that. It's about how you portray yourself, okay? And in the book, we're documenting with, we've talked to a lot of people in elite businesses across the world about what are cultural codes, and what we do is we conflate these things with talent, right? We think because someone talks in a posh way in England that they're cleverer than they are. I've done some summaries of studies in schools. I do lots of work with teachers, and what we found was even teachers, who honestly are the people that have the best interest in children, even teachers will subconsciously, unconsciously underrate children if they have a working class background. So we've looked at tests and we compared them to teacher judgments, and it's always an interesting exercise you can do with teachers. So a lot of my work with teachers is thinking about just trying to think about our unconscious biases in the classroom. It certainly happens in universities as well. What we found is lecturers and teachers interact less with people who are less like them, basically. And that's about ethnicity, it's about class, it's about gender, etc., etc. We've talked about intergenerational trends, so I will move on. Teresa, how much time have I got? 20 minutes, okay, good to know. So, sorry, this is all a bit depressing, isn't it? But I will end on some positive things that I think we can do, and I do think we can improve life and opportunity. So there was that golden era, as I spoke about. In England, it was really those post-war years, so the 1950s to the sort of about 1980. But you see this across the OECD, and this is looking at children like me, I guess, who come from parents who would have left school quite early. What is the chances of you going into tertiary education or higher education? And while there was progress, this is again looking at cohorts, children born in the 1950s all the way up to 85 here, we're seeing a kind of plateauing of that. So we're not improving, if you like, from generation to generation. As I said, my work is about your background shouldn't tell what you do, whatever it is you choose to do, but we still need people going to university from all backgrounds, right? But it's not necessarily for everyone, but we still need it to be accessible to those from all backgrounds. This is an American graph, and it's reflected a lot in other countries as well. This is the gap. In England, we would look at children on free school meals versus those not on free school meals, but you see this gap. I call it the constant gap. If you ever go to the London Underground, you always hear that thing, mind the gap, and I'm always thinking about this for these sort of graphs. The gaps have stayed constant for many years, and my interpretation of this and the stuff that I do with schools is one, that I think schools are counterbalancing those inequities that we're seeing in society, but also, as I said, I think there are some fundamental issues with the school system in that I don't believe we are serving all our children. And one of the issues we'll come to in England is that we still have a very academic system. So we reward people like me who happen to be quite academic. We don't reward people who are creative or vocational. And again, be very interested in the Irish context there. So what can we do about all this? And equalising the playing field, as I said, that sort of metaphor that I've used a lot here. And for me, I'm a professor of social mobility, and that's, as I said, we look at origins of people and where they come to, and it gives us an indicator of equality of opportunity in society. It's not perfect, but it gives us that sense of do we have equal opportunities? But in England, the social mobility debate, as I said, that Daily Mail article, we tend to sort of think about it in an individualistic way. Now, I have done lots of work as charity CEO for the Sutton Trust in enabling young people to consider university, for example, in England. There are many things we can do for individuals to help them navigate the system, provide early years support, actually, I would add to that. Social justice for me is more about thinking about the actual rules of the system. So I do work with civil servants in England, British civil servants, and it's really interesting. Many of them come from working class backgrounds. We help understand the rules of the game, and it's really interesting. In the civil service in England, there are these informal rules. If you're going for a promotion, you go and have an informal chat with the manager in a way that if you were from a working class background, you might not understand that that's how you play the game again. I did some really interesting report with a bunch of civil servants, and it was part of the socio-economic diversity group in the British Civil Service. But what we had was a very interesting debate, because they were saying to me, Lee, this is all great, but unless we actually challenge the system, we are all going to be middle-class clones, essentially, trying to fit into this system. So part of the report was actually also challenging the way the civil service in England chooses people, how it identifies talent. So, for example, we were looking at things like people that come through with apprenticeships rather than maybe a degree, but also in promotion, how do we recognise talent from different backgrounds? So that was kind of an interesting debate. I think a key thing for me on social justice in the education system is, are we valuing people with those other skills, vocational, creative, as well as academic? The thing about academic skills is that you can measure it easily, so you can test it. And that makes it very gameable, some people in my field would say, for the middle classes to retain their position at the top. And the issue we have in modern society is now we have this thing called the meritocratic elites. So these are elites that are so dangerous in many ways, because they can say, I've got my degree, I've got my thing, right? And it's because, of course, they had those advantages in the first place. So you've got to just be really careful with some of the ways that we measure talent. By the way, in England, there has been a boom in private tutoring over the last 30 years. I would argue that A-levels in our system, which you get at age 18, are as much a product of your background as it is your academic promise, right? And by the way, I've become a middle-class parent. I have got extra private tutoring for my children. We all do it, I'm not blaming people, in a sense, for wanting the best for their children. Anyone here who's got children will know this. It's the system that we need to think about, and how we enable all people to have a fair chance if they don't have that support. I've become increasingly convinced that we need a bigger social reset of our societies. I would go as far to say that I think modern capitalism is broken. I think that promise that everyone can lead a decent life has kind of disappeared in many countries. So this is not about sort of being rich or famous. This is literally being able to live with a roof over your head, with the basic entitlements that all children should have. I think that has started to go in many of these countries that we are watching. And some of that is about housing, which I'll come back to. These are just some of the examples in these different areas. Won't have time to go through them all, and I've been involved in a lot of these areas. What I would say to you, and I'm really looking forward to a debate on the early years side, because I think improving early years support probably actually ticks all these boxes. If you asked me if you really pushed me, I would say early years support for those from the poorest background is probably one of my priorities as a social mobility expert. But what I would also say is that it needs your support ideally needs to be longitudinal, lifelong. What do I mean by that is that it can't just stop in the early years, because a lot of the research I've been involved in shows that sadly it fades. So if you lose support at age 5, 10, whatever it is, then you will regress back. So yes, let's start with early years, but think about what happens afterwards. On the social justice front, I've sort of mentioned this, but I think it's the multi-dimensional aspect of talent. And by the way, it's not just about vocational and creative skills, it's also about things like generosity and giving back to people and the common good. I often do sessions with teachers about valuing parents who do come from more working-class backgrounds and children who might have just been generous to another pupil, right? It's not just about the academic side of things. There are many parents, by the way, who've had really bad experiences of schooling, and that stays with you, right? My history stays with me. You might think I sound like this very confident professor, honestly, but your history stays with you. So we must always remember that. It's a theme throughout my work. What I'd also say with this, and I know governments are really stretched, there's all competing priorities, but if we were really serious about creating a fair society, we would operate outside, of course, the education system as well as inside. If you gave me another priority, it probably would be affordable housing for people. I think it's such a profound impact on future things. Of course, I'd like to do all these things. In England, there's a lot of chat about growth. The government is obsessed with economic growth. My challenge to all governments that say that is that it has to be inclusive growth. What I'm finding with the data is a lot of that economic growth accrues to those at the top of society, that there isn't this trickle down that people used to talk about in the 1980s and 90s. So you have to do these. A lot, by the way, of that social reset isn't even about redistribution of taxation, although I would probably advocate a wealth tax. It's about what we would call pre-distribution. It's trying to level the playing field before children grow up. So I'd love the early years, and I'm looking forward to some of the debate around that. But I think we need also a bigger debate about, and I called it common good capitalism here. You know, the whole idea that we are just measured because of our merit and our success. I think we need to rethink some of the basics around what we value. And I think Ireland, you know, as someone from the outside, I admire much of Irish culture because I do think it speaks to some of that actually. And as someone who plays guitar in a band of professors, that when I come over here, I'm valued as much for that creative side as the academic side. Anyway, so that's just an observation. I call this Irish Spotlight. Honestly, I'm almost embarrassed to put this slide in because I am not an expert on Ireland, but these are some of the things that came out when I looked at some of the international literature. Like London, I suspect there are areas where property prices have now got so high that they lock out those people, and this has a profound impact because often some of those destination schools tend to be in those areas. So you see this sort of generational persistence of these issues. I know about some of the amazing work, and actually, I have been incredibly admiring of some of the teacher leaders in this country where I've shared a panel with. But those educational inequalities are still starting. If you start in the early years, I think you have a better chance. I was involved in a study looking at the transitions from 5 to 16. We found that the children in England who don't get basic maths and English at age 16, and by the way, that's where I would focus my education policy, less about people like me who might get into top universities. I would go for what are the rates of children, and I'll be very interested to know what it is in Ireland. In England, there's still about 25-30% of children who don't get basic literacy and numeracy at age 16. It's a tragedy. It is a scandal in many ways. I would focus more attention on those young people. We found that half of those at age 16 who didn't get English and maths were judged to be falling behind at age 5 by their teachers. So there's something that obviously is happening from 5 to 16. So it comes back to that longitudinal point. I love Dublin, honestly, even as an honorary Kerry man here, but I suspect, my challenge to you would be, to what extent are you having a genuine regional industrial policy, if we want to call it a grand term? Where are the jobs in this country? In England, we have a real issue with this, and the government is trying to redistribute jobs to different parts of England. But honestly, if you go to England, you visit England, you go to the north, and I have many friends and family in the north, we are still recovering from the miners' strike, honestly, a generation ago, where those places got hollowed out, right, because of various things. We haven't really replaced the jobs there, okay? So you have to have some sort of regional, and then early childhood inequalities, which I guess we're going to hear about later. Right, some final sort of comments. Oh, it's a bit dark here. I just wanted to mention very quickly some of my own work with schools. So I do a lot of work with school leaders on what I call equity in education. This is about doing more for those children facing extra barriers. We talk about extra barriers, so I don't use the term disadvantaged pupils. I think that implicitly blames those pupils for their disadvantage. I always use children from disadvantaged background. It might seem like a sort of small thing, but if you use terms like disadvantaged, you immediately, in my view, fall into that deficit labelling. So I do lots of work with teachers about language and the interaction with the classroom. We'll skip this for time because it'd be good to see if there's any questions. But the other thing I thought you'd be interested in is we're doing a lot of work with teachers around being community hubs, and I'm sure it's happening here as well. Because teachers want to do the best for their children, what's happening in England is at school-to-school level, they are just doing more for things outside of the core, I suppose, teaching role that those schools have. So there's lots of schemes I've been involved in. There's been a big debate in England about dental health. I don't know if you've had it here, but many of our children do not have dental health. If you go into a classroom and your teeth are aching, you're not going to learn. We've done things like Classes for Glasses, where we provide glasses in the school. We found a lot of teachers were diagnosing children with special education needs, but they had poor eyesight. So there's these, what I would say that a lot of the things that I had when I was younger are now not maybe there in terms of the children of today. And if you're not sleeping well, if you're not getting to college or school, then of course you're not going to be able to learn when you get to the classroom. It's a real balancing act for schools in England because their budgets have been stretched. And the debate that I have with teacher leaders is really about how do you balance the focus on teaching and learning in the classroom, which is not a trivial challenge for many teachers, with doing these extra things as a community hub. And there's some amazing teacher leaders who are doing work in this. And as I said, I've been really inspired by some of the teacher leaders in Ireland about this equity approach who've told me some of the stuff they're doing. There's an equity scorecard we produce for schools. It's like a guide, a checklist for what you're doing in your school. You have to be really careful with this because education, as I said, can't solve all these issues. For me, it has to be about broader social policy. Now, just to finish with some sort of inspirational quotes from me, honestly, I'm not anti-American, but honestly, I would not advise to go down the American societal route. I think it's a very unequal country, but there are some amazing people that have come from America. And I do think that there was a golden era. One of my political heroes is Roosevelt. This is Franklin D. Roosevelt. It was amazing what he was doing. This is sort of the pre-post-war. This is nearly 100 years ago now. But I don't know if people have known the history of this, but he had free higher education for the GIs that came back from the war. There was housing subsidies for people, for poorers. He actually suggested, imagine this, that there would be a ceiling on salaries. Can you imagine Trump adhering to that? It didn't get through even then. I guess my point with Roosevelt is for governments, you have to intervene in a very actionable, serious way. And it's really interesting in American history because I feel like the neoliberal kind of assumptions have spread across the world, including America, which is to kind of have less state intervention actually and to let the markets in a way improve growth, and through growth we all benefit. I'm not convinced that that model works. I think governments have to intervene where needed to equalise that playing field. And then the last quote, and of course the inspiring Martin Luther King, what I like about this is, you see, there's lots of debate about diversity initiatives in the UK and globally, and I speak to a lot of global employers about this. Socioeconomic background often isn't in diversity initiatives, and I think that's terrible because it's the missing dimension in many ways. It shouldn't be by the way, a competition. It's also about all the other characteristics that are very important. But the problem with diversity is that it's kind of scratching the surface of the deeper issue, which is inequalities, economic inequality, poverty. And so I love this quote from Martin Luther King. It's from 1968, just before he was assassinated. And it was really, I think, a really good point. You know, you can make things accessible to all, but if those people don't have the money to buy things, then of course the root cause isn't addressed. So, with that, I'm going to finish. Oh, sorry, this is the next slide. Shall I leave it on that slide there? Yeah, I'll stay on this slide. But hopefully we've got some time for questions. Thank you very much. I hope that wasn't too much for you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lee. I'm sure that has given rise to a lot of questions from our audience. And much of what you said we'll have an opportunity to talk about later when our panellists are able. We'll be hearing about the Child Poverty and Wellbeing Unit, we'll be hearing about Equal Start, we'll be hearing about a project in Ballyfermot. So I think we will really have an opportunity to get into some of the questions that you've posed for us. But before we do that, before we have our panel, Lee is open to taking a few questions. If there's anything in particular that anybody in the audience would like to put to Lee before we ask our panel to join us. Anybody? If you wouldn't mind introducing yourself, please.
Hello, I'm Michelle Hart. I'm the CEO of the National Childhood Network, and we are based just up the country in Monaghan, close to the border. Thank you so much for a wonderful keynote today. I was just wondering, you know, in that squeezed middle that you're talking about, and we see it all the time. Like I saw a clip recently that said that there were people earning 100,000 sterling in England, and yet because of childcare costs, because of what they consider themselves not to be wealthy or on that trajectory. And I don't know, we seem to see this ideology around this individualist in that, particularly I see that coming through that space more and more, that when we can, for people who really, really need it, that middle ground is shouting and saying, what about us, we don't have enough, and you cannot do that. Like for a long time we've been looking for a second tier child benefit here, but I think the government's nearly afraid to bring it in because of that middle ground that are going to be saying, and that rise of individual as a part of, as opposed to that collective sort of thinking.
Yeah, no, I'm seeing this globally. So in the book, the latest book, we looked at India, which is fascinating, where they have a caste system still, I would argue. And there's been a real backlash in India from those from the middle sort of ground again to, I think, quite progressive quotas. They have quotas for lower caste backgrounds. So a proportion of students at the very top universities in India will come from lower caste backgrounds, and they have to get lower scores to get in. It's caused a huge debate in India. And it's this very similar thing. I would say, by the way, that individualism has seeped into many societies. China and India, I would add to this list, which are about a third of the world, by the way. That's why I'm interested in those countries as well. But you also see it, by the way, even in the Nordics. I do a lot of talks in, I love the Nordics, I love Scandinavians, because they do better than most countries. But even there, you're seeing a bit of that individualism seep into this, because the global influence of America particularly, but also I'd say Britain, those kind of, that American dream is very strong myth, I think. And if you have a very unequal society, and I get this, I have instincts like this. I have a 21 and 22-year-old. I'm like thinking, when the hell, what jobs are they ever going to get? As a parent, you are driven by that. And it makes, I think the problem with inequalities is that it makes us all, it always moves us to that more individualistic notion, right? It forces us into that. So I think for governments, it's really difficult. I mean, in Britain, what I often now talk about is barriers to opportunity. In a way, I'm trying to be inclusive to that middle ground as well, because there'll be many children, and like here, we have a special education needs crisis, we have a school attainment crisis, we have a significant number of children who aren't coming to school. It's not all of those from the poorest backgrounds. It's a real tension in my work, because the equity approach that I work with teachers in England and other bits of the UK is, equity is doing more for those that need it most. And there is a real tension here, but I tend to use the language of barriers to opportunity to almost speak to that wider group. But for me, you have to think about the extent of those barriers, and in my view, the government has more responsibility to help those that are facing those extra barriers. But I think it's really difficult, and it's led to some of, in England, the populist, polarised politics that we're seeing elsewhere in the world as well. Because those, and again, I'm not being political here, but there are certain political parties that have seemingly the solutions, but I'm not convinced that they do. But they're speaking to a lot of people who feel like they've worked all their lives but aren't leading a decent life. And that is something that's very, very much affecting modern politics. And the metropolitan elites, which we have in England, are really struggling with this, because the current Labour cabinet in England, most of them have come through that university route. So there's a lot of scepticism about that if you've gone through a different route. So I'm seeing this globally. It's very interesting.
Thank you. With that, I might ask our panelists to join us at the top table, please, and we'll ask them we'll pose a few questions to them. So if you take your seats here. Do you want to sit down as well, Lee?
Shall I sit down?
No, I think you should stay here. Yeah? We have a pretty gender balanced table. It could be at these events, we might be lucky to have a man at all, but we have 2 today, so that's great. So I'm sure plenty of people on the panel will be known to you all, but just as the chair, and just in case you don't know them, I'm going to introduce you to our panel. So next to Lee is Elizabeth Canavan, I think commonly known as Liz. And Liz is the Assistant Secretary General of the Social Policy and Public Service Reform Division in the Department of the Taoiseach. And Liz is Secretary to several Cabinet subcommittees, and she is Chair of the Associated Senior Officials Group. Previously, she held the position of Assistant Secretary General in the Department of Children and Youth Affairs. She's native of Galway and a graduate of Dublin City University, from which she holds a BA in Humanities, and she also has a diploma from the Institute of Directors. You're very welcome, Liz. Next to Liz, we have Kieran Madden, and Kieran is Head of Access, Inclusion, Research and the Data Unit at the Department of Children, Disability and Equality. Kieran has previously worked in finance, compliance, research, evaluation and policy roles within the department. He has a background in psychology and psychotherapy, and he studied governance at the IPA. Next to Kieran is Dr. Laura O'Reilly, and Laura is Chief Executive of the Ballyfermot Rialto Beag Star, which is a community drug and alcohol service. Laura holds a PhD from the School of Social Work and Social Policy in Trinity College, and Laura has extensive practice experience working frontline and leading community-based drug and alcohol recovery services. And at the end, we have Tanya Ward, who is the CEO of the Children's Rights Alliance since 2012, and she is also currently president of Eurochild. Previously, Tanya was the director of the Irish Council for Civil Liberties, where she worked for 8 years. She is a former lecturer in human rights in Trinity College and the UCD School of Social Justice. She was former chair of the National Advisory Council for Children and Young People from 2018 to 2022, and is currently a member of the Young Ireland Advisory Council. So can I ask you to welcome all of our panel, and we'll get going. Thank you very much. So, I don't know, Lee, if you are aware that we have a Child Poverty and Wellbeing Programme Office in the Department of the Taoiseach. And Liz, you and your colleagues in the unit have been working for the past 2.5 years, driving cross-government action to tackle child poverty. It was an innovative development, one which a lot of us, I'm sure, in the room were very happy when it was introduced. So it's great to have an opportunity to ask you to tell us about the work of the office and its key achievements to date, and maybe what you think some of the challenges are at the moment.
Okay. So thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here this morning. So I think many of you know the kind of the work we've been doing. Our programme plan is nearly 2 years old now, so we are actually beginning to think about what our next programme plan might look like. And I guess one of the things when the office was set up was what was our level of ambition, and I suppose there was a lot riding on it in terms of from the advocacy world in terms of what could it deliver. So we've always been very conscious of whether we're having an impact or not. So some of you will know we published a progress report last year. We did a survey of stakeholders and government departments to see, did people feel we were making a difference? We were also very involved with the piece of work with the OECD, looking at centres of government and the kind of impact that the Child Poverty Office might have. And one of the things that's coming up there is whether we should sort of narrow our focus, get really focused on a smaller number of topics. We're still thinking about, what that means for our next programme plan. Obviously, Anna's here today. Anna and I engage a lot with all of the stakeholders and meet people as much as we can and get involved as much as we can. So we get a lot of feedback all the time on our work. But I guess we've been really trying to figure out what is the impact to date. So I suppose if I was going to describe what we think we have done, I think through the cross-government network, we've really made a lot stronger connections, not just within the statutory, but across statutory, non-statutory. But within the statutory, right across the civil and public service, we know for sure that we have generated a lot of new connections between policymakers, providers, and I suppose getting people thinking a lot more about the kind of service they provide and how it relates to other services. And we'll say a little bit more about that when we're talking about early education and care. And one of the things that we were doing in the context of our Child Poverty Summit next week is our action learning sets, where we've asked people to come up with, an intractable problem that they think we could try to solve together. So more of that later in the week at our Child Poverty Summit. The other thing we've been doing is working with, collaborating with CSO and government departments around data sharing. So this is really trying to make more use of what are our data holdings, and much of this is administrative data. But we have, joined the dots in a few places, and we're hoping that's going to yield a deeper, more granular understanding of some of the impacts of different policies and, I suppose, around the kind of challenges that children, young people still face. I think it's fair to say we've brought a fair bit of political attention, although you're doing a very good job yourselves. But we have brought a lot of political attention to child poverty, and we have a dedicated children's cabinet committee where we get the opportunity to talk about some of the issues and maybe to highlight and emphasise some of the challenges that children, young people face. And it was interesting, Lee, you were talking about housing. I mean, we would see family homelessness as one of our biggest priorities, and we have, been able to present the detailed work on the impact of family homelessness, even brief periods of homelessness on children, and how persistent that is. So we've had a lot of opportunity to sort of raise some of the issues and bring some of the data and evidence and understanding to the Cabinet Committee, which I think is really important. And I think we can see that in the way that some of the ministers, Taoiseach and the Taoiseach, have been talking about child poverty in previous, in the last year, I'd say. In addition to that, we've done the budget reports, and as you know, we try to take a very objective view of whether the budgets are yielding or not, and we'll be doing another one this year. And obviously we've our summit later this week, which again is trying to highlight, I suppose, the challenges that remain and bring the greatest visibility to the issue, particularly in advance of the budget process. So that's sort of where we're at the moment.
And when we focus, And Liz, when we focus in then on today's theme of early childhood education and care, over the next 5 years, what systemic shifts, and we heard from Lee about, not only helping people through the system, but maybe changes that are needed to the system. So what systemic shift do you think are needed in early childhood education and care to ensure that it helps to break the cycle for families experiencing intergenerational poverty and trauma?
Yeah, so when we look at our 6 priorities, this is the one area where we feel like we're very much on the right track. We have the right policies, we know what we need to do. And I think Equal Start is a really important programme, and it's that targeted programme that's embedded within the universal system we think is really critical. So we kind of know the right things to do, and it's an investment in that's going to deliver real change. But obviously there's also universal investment across other aspects of childcare, so building supply and capacity and strengthening the workforce. I think the second thing that we would think is really important is, even for whether it's schools or early years, they are operating in a community, in an environment. So I think where we will get a better bang for our buck is if we can strengthen the linkages between service providers, whether schools or early years, with the wider community and the services in that wider community. So we obviously have that in some areas already, because that's the way the services grew up, but not in all areas. And it's those gaps, and I suppose it's bringing those things together that give us the greater than the sum of the parts, and that's where we think the real value is going to be. So it's that connection between earlier services and the rest of the environment that these families live in. And I think the third thing I would say, and it is part of what we want to do as part of investment in childcare and early years generally, is valuing the profession. And I think, again, it's to the point Lee made. If we look at other countries, we know this, that people who work in that profession are on a par with teachers. they're seen to be incredibly important professionals, as they are. So they are the first people who see children outside the home setting. It's early in the child's life. They have the best possibility and opportunity maybe to spot something, so we can intervene early where we know there's the best opportunity of having an impact. So they're my sort of three things.
I'm sure there's a lot of people in the room that welcomed that. Thank you very much, Liz. And it has echoes of one of the points that you made, Lee, about working inside and outside the school gates. So it evokes that, I think. Back to that. We'll move on to Kieran, and don't worry, we'll have time for you to ask questions in a little while, but we'll hear from all the panellists first. Kieran, the Department of Children and Equality, CDE. That's what I have to do. It's CDE, Department of Children, Disability and Equality. The Equal Start funding programme was launched in May 24, so a little over a year in place now. So can you tell us about maybe a general description about the programme for some of the people in the room who may not know a lot about it, and the progress that has been made to date on its rollout?
Well, of course, yeah. First of all, just to welcome the invitation to today's event and the discussion on Equal Start. It's something that we're very, excited about, and something that we're very much welcoming as well. The debate on the budget allocation in 2026 and any sort of help there is on that is very much welcomed. So in terms of Equal Start itself, I suppose I don't want to put the danger of actually listing things out here, because I suppose it is a kind of a very broad and very large model, and I suppose it's worth just going through bits and pieces. So it's a funding model overall and a set of universal and targeted measures, and the central aim is supporting access and full participation in early learning and care and school-age childcare, and that's for children and families who are experiencing disadvantage. So it's a suite of universal, child-targeted and setting-targeted supports, and with the aim of ensuring that all children can actually access and will benefit from a continuum of supports that reflect a continuum of need. So it prioritises settings where disadvantage is concentrated, and that's to support parents, providers and communities that are most in need. In terms of the resourcing of the services to support families, we're, I suppose, looking to, in particular, resource relationships. So that's the relationships between services and parents, and between the services, parents and, I suppose, interagency groups as well, and wider community supports, including in time schools and other agencies. And the key goal being to access and to meaningfully engage with, I suppose, the families in disadvantage who are already accessing childcare, but also those who are harder to reach, who are not accessing childcare at present, and who we know from our data are, I suppose, are not participating at the same levels as other cohorts. Just our achievements to date, so we've 788 Tier 1 and Tier 2 services who are identified as operating in concentrated disadvantage, and they have priority designation and are now receiving additional supports. They've been receiving support since September 2024. And that's a flexible funding for additional staff hours, and that can be used to support engagement between the settings and families, additional contact and non-contact time, CPD and training days, and then other child and family support services at the interagency level. We've supported the funding of TUSLA's rollout of the Traveller Parenting Support Programme in 17 TUSLA areas, and there's responsibilities on family link workers to engage with Traveller parents of young children and to support them to attend and participate in early learning and childcare. There's a Little Library initiative. So libraries across the country, they have been provided with book bags for children that can pick up the book bags, and then we're encouraging uptake of library membership from a very young age, and that's one of our universal schemes. Pobal Better Start recently appointed 2 travel and enrollment advisory specialists to work to promote inclusive ELC and SAC. We've started the coordinated rollout of Early Talk Boost, and that's through Better Start as well in Pobal, and that's coordinated between Pobal Better Start, the HSC and the ABC programs, and that's an intervention at the for language delay to settings with a priority designation. So you may have seen recently that we introduced Bia Blasta, which is a preschool nutrition program, and that's for targeted preschools. It was launched last month, and payments are due to commence from October for services that opt in for participation. there's 4.2 million available this year for that, and that includes an equipment grant for services who want to, I suppose, purchase equipment so that they can actually provide the programme. A tender has been awarded for the review of the current inclusion coordinator role, so that's a role that's been in place already through the access and inclusion model, but we're updating that and the LINK programme to be, have more, I suppose, emphasis on inclusivity. And then in terms of equality, diversity, inclusion guidelines, we're beginning, I suppose, the review and new training for that as well shortly. And then, just given my own background as well, the monitoring and evaluation framework that's currently in development. That's going to be really key for us in terms of guiding us in terms of what's working and what needs to, I suppose, be tweaked, or what we need to respond to over time. So for 2026, we really want to build on the progress, and I suppose just talking about kind of the wider context. So if we're talking about a €50 million target, there's the wider childcare offering in which Equal Start is delivered. So that includes the National Childcare Scheme, AIM extensions that we're working on, and then core funding, in particular educator pay, and then CPD opportunities, which are going to be very, very important in terms of Equal Start delivery. And then just, you're probably all aware of the action plan to set out the future steps to reduce the cost of childcare to €200 per month as per the programme for government commitment. And then I suppose just, you know, for ourselves then, that the National Childcare Scheme is, you know, has built-in flexibility around the income assessed thresholds and the multiple child discounts. And we are, I suppose, you know, in terms of the budget, that's another factor for us in terms of addressing disadvantage and child poverty, as well as, I suppose, kind of committing to working with partner bodies to further support the NCS sponsor subsidy. That's another part that we see is really key to Equal Start, even though it's part of the wider offering. And then obviously core funding, I suppose looking for greater investment in services, in particular EY educators. And then I suppose for parents, you know, we're working on, I suppose, fees and looking at bringing down fees across the country as well. And of course, that all needs additional investment.
That's a whistle-stop tour of everything in Equal Start. Thanks a million, Kieran. You know, I mentioned earlier the Child Poverty Monitor, last year's Child Poverty Monitor, which had a spotlight on YMCA childcare in it, and I'm sure some of you may have seen the children either going to or coming from their service. But one of the things that I thought, because again it echoes what we've just heard from Lee and from Liz, it talks about that Equal Start allowed the staff to engage with parents and other agencies and complementary supports, which is, I think, what we heard you talking about, Liz. And probably more critically, that it allowed children and families feel a sense of community belonging. I mean, that's quite the impact to be able to have achieved from the introduction of the model here. So, you know, in terms of what we're trying to achieve, they're pretty good impacts and pretty good outcomes, I would suggest. And I would be wrong not to say that all the affordability measures are really very welcome. But the only way that a service makes lasting impact for children if it's a quality service, so we have to make sure that the services are not just available, but that they're of a high quality too. So that's important that we all agree that as a fundamental principle. Now, moving on.
Or shall I wait to the end?
Maybe wait to the end, if you don't mind. No, it's fine. Yeah. I'm I cheeky telling the keynote speaker to wait his turn.
Sorry. I'm a sharp elbow.
So now we're going to move on to Dr. Laura O'Reilly, who is as I said, the Chief Executive of Ballyfermot Rail Beag Star. And Laura, I think maybe quite a lot of people may not know the project, so can you tell us a little bit about it, the needs of the children and families that you're working with, and what, from your experience, you think is needed to break the cycle of intergenerational poverty and trauma?
They're very big questions. Now, get me started. So I'm Laura O'Reilly from Ballyfermot Star. You'll see from the information we do have an early years service, but I'm just going to mention our other services first before I speak about that. As a community service provider, we were set up kind of nearly 30 years ago, and we're a community response to local drug and alcohol related issues, and we very much work from a community development response. So as a community development response to drug and alcohol related issues, we have a number of services. So we firstly kind of very much try to challenge the stigma that surrounds substance use, and those issues, Lee, that you mentioned are really, I suppose for us in our service, we see that addiction and substance use is a symptom of lots of other social and economic issues that people in our community have experienced. So we provide kind of one-to-one supports to people who have drug and alcohol issues. We have a rehabilitation and recovery day programme, which is a community employment programme, and we also offer significant support to family members of those who are experiencing their own personal addictions. One of the key things that we do kind of comes back to some of those points you raised, Lee, is often people who are in our services have had very poor opportunities. They've had poor economic opportunities, poor educational opportunities. Often poverty was a key feature of their lives, and the people who we work with have suffered kind of several traumas throughout their lives, and that substance use continues then to exacerbate those kind of previous traumatic experiences. So we work to support adults and other family members. About 20 years ago, it became very kind of obvious to us that in our service that we were basically seeing kind of generations of the same family who was coming through our services. So we currently might have grandparents, parents and children who are accessing our services. And it became really apparent to us that if we wanted to be able to tackle those kind of issues that people in our community were being faced with, that we really needed to take a few steps back. So we were working with people from a recovery point, from a treatment and recovery point of view, but actually what we were going to see then was that children within households were also being impacted by substance use, but also the other issues that go hand in hand with substance use. So the issues that a lot of the families that we're working with are faced with is substance use, domestic violence, mental health issues, homelessness, poverty, and a range of other trauma experiences. So, getting to our early years, Rail Beag is our early years service, and we work with 26 children on a daily basis in our early years. That programme has been very much set up with, I suppose, with a vision in mind to work with families as a unit together, where often what happens is somebody's working with the children, someone's working with the adults, someone's working with the grandparents. So for us, we were in a really kind of a nice position to be able to try and work with entire families together. We do that through our early years service, but I suppose it's really important to say that as early years providers, our staff team are they're doing more than just providing early year services. They're providing kind of families with basic supports around kind of how to, the basic needs that children might need to ensure that those needs are met. We're supporting families to address those other issues that I've just mentioned. So I think for us, what's really important is to try and work with families as a unit together, and we do that. We're in a unique position that we've a team of people that have different skill sets, and we that we can work with different parts of a family together, but providing that kind of early stage kind of interventions to the families who are working with, we see as being crucial to being able to begin to attempt to break or disrupt the intergenerational trauma that kind of families are experiencing, and substance use and addiction then just becomes a symptom of those other issues. I think, have I answered that one? Yeah.
I'd say there could be more questions for you, but thank you for that general introduction, Laura. And now, last but absolutely by no means least, we have Tanya Ward. And Tanya, so the Alliance is calling for Budget 26 to be the children's budget, and as part of that you're calling for an increase of 50 million in the funding available for Equal Start in particular. So two questions to you. What difference could that make to breaking the cycle of intergenerational poverty and trauma that we've heard and we've just heard from Laura? And what priority actions would you like to see the government introduce in the next iteration of Equal Start, or the next stage of Equal Start?
Okay, thanks
Thanks.
very much. Thanks, Teresa. And I do kind of feel the answer just been covered already by Laura. But I suppose what I might do is maybe point to data and bring it back to some of what Lee talked about. So we know already that the data is very clear. If you invest in these types of programs, they are very successful in breaking the cycle of poverty. And Professor Mary Daly led a good deal of the research that informed the development of the EU Child Guarantee, which is an EU measure. Countries around Europe are meant to introduce these key measures, and it has a 10-year research base. One of the things they realised from the data was that wraparound early years programmes like Ballyfermot Star are actually possibly the best investments that governments can make if they want to break the cycle of poverty. She said they even worked out it was probably even more instrumental than income as a measure. And if there was one thing that Europe could succeed on is actually have these early years wraparound services established throughout the region. So that's one thing. We commissioned research in the Children's Rights Alliance really to pull together what does the literature say. Now we already knew the answer, but we thought we'd pull it together to try and inspire the politicians. And again, it said very similar things. There's lots of international research tracking children that have gone through these programs, and they've tracked through where do they end up. And of course what happens is they start in school, they do better in school, the transitions are much more successful, they do better in their exams, and then they're more likely to get a better job. They're less likely to experience housing insecurity, and then when they go on to have children themselves, their children are less likely to live in poverty. So it's pretty clear the evidence base is really strong for investing in these types of programs. And I suppose if there's one thing that the government can ensure happens, because we're in a very unique position to have a unit slap bang in the middle of the Department of Taoiseach that is influencing and working across governments to get these measures that we know that work established. If there's one thing we can measure as an element of success, it's to get our Equal Start programme established and properly funded. And of course, it's up and running now, but are we putting the resources that we need into that programme? In terms of the success of these types of programmes, I might point to one in the UK, actually, the Sure Start programme, that many of you are probably familiar with, because I know when the UK established it under the Brown-Blair government, it was something we were all watching in Ireland at the time. And of course, it had its faults, but they're already tracking really positive outcomes from the Sure Start programme. So we know when that group of young people have done their exams, they've done better in their exams this time round. I was looking at the stories of Angela Rayner, the deputy leader of Labour Party, who just stepped down just before the weekend, and looking at some of the profile pieces on her. And she says she was a mum, very difficult childhood, living with a mum with serious mental health issues. She had to look after her mother. She actually had to get the A&E to take her mum in and section her. She was so ill, and she was very young living through that, and she had a baby at 16 and dropped out of school. But she says the Sure Start programme was instrumental in helping her get to the next stage in her life. So we know these programmes work. There's a very strong data set, and they're probably the smartest investment that the government can make. In terms of what would need to be invested in, let's say, the next steps, we've just done a survey of a lot of the services working in this space, and what came through was really struggling with the government scheme at the moment for funding them. This is the scheme I think, Kieran, you mentioned. I know you're looking at reviewing that, but we do have a national childcare scheme. You can get sponsored places under that if you're a provider, but the focus of the National Childcare Scheme is on work activation, and that can be a problem if you've got some families that just aren't in that place, they're not quite able to get into work. And we know work is really important. You're less likely to be in poverty if you're in work, but there's so many other things going on in the family that it's not a possibility. And that's something that needs to be looked at. Some of the services that we've talked to have said they're trying to get sponsor places and they're just not able to. They have to go through TUSLA, the Child and Family Agency, and it's really hard to get that sponsorship. Actually, the previous scheme, the CCS scheme, it was much easier to get those places sponsored. And what that meant was the services were well able to provide that everyday, essentials that children need, make sure they were fed, sometimes buy clothes for them, and they had a lower staff to child ratio so they could work with the children and then also try and do a little bit of work with the families as well. So that's something that does need to be looked at. TUSLA tell me that they have a new early intervention team reform programme coming out in January, and that should help with that. But we were always a bit concerned with it going through TUSLA because the threshold for intervention by TUSLA is actually just so high with the Child and Family Agency. So that's something I think we need to look at. The other thing that is coming up when we talk to the services is capital budget. So they have very little if they want to update their services. There's very contentious, there's small budgets available at the moment, but the other bit, if they want to expand their provision, they all have long waiting lists. So, my frustration is often there's so much talent in these services actually. Wouldn't it be great if we could get more out of these services? But how can they expand their provision if they've no capital budgets? I know big decisions are being made at the moment in government about the Apple tax money. And of course, a lot of that will go into infrastructure, and rightfully so. These services are one of the most important infrastructural projects that we should be investing in as well. And I'd love to see that happen. And on top of that, EcoStart having a good amount of sizable resources so you can expand out. There's an ambitious programme. It's a really well-designed programme. It's excellent at identifying inequality and where to invest, and it's well-researched, and it's very much based on the views of communities and parents that were consulted on it. But does it have the resources it needs to have the impact it could have? I think that's where I'd love to see the budget make a big difference.
Thanks, Tanya. So that's her pitch for the budget clearly laid out. And I'm sure there's lots of listening ears in the room, which is great. So we're going to move on to some questions, and Lee, I'm going to have nice manners and come back to you first, because you had a question, and if I could ask members of the audience to just give me a nod or lift your hand or whatever, and I'll call you to ask your question in order then afterwards. We have a good bit of time, so hopefully we'll get a good bit of discussion going. So, Lee, you had a question.
Yeah, it was just a reflection, and I loved what everyone was saying on the panel. Another principle that I adhere to, this is showing my age and musical interest, is the Bananarama principle. For those who are young, probably don't know this reference, but it was a song in the 1980s. It's not what you do, it's the way you do it. It's actually an Ella Fitzgerald song. And it's one of the principles that I adhere to because I absolutely agree on early years, but it's always the quality of the people doing it. And I think that's been the big challenge for most governments. The other thing has been the long-term nature of this. I mean, we should have a 25, 30-year strategy. The problem is politics is becoming daily, and so I think I've had some discussions in England, could you set it aside slightly for this government agency almost that isn't a prey to political... Sure Start was an amazing scheme, and it got lost in the austerity years in Britain. Could it have been protected? But that point about how it's doing, and hearing Kieran as well talking about this stuff, some of the best practice I've seen in this space is in the schools area, in the way that they interact with parents from different backgrounds. And again, I'm obsessed with this. They shouldn't be done to, should be done with. And there's an instant power imbalance I find when I go and visit schemes, and I'm sure you think about this, Laura, in that somehow you've got to empower, allow those parents, because I do think they have something actually, you know, it's just because of years of deprivation. So and when teachers do it well, they do it brilliantly, but there's lots of schemes in England which I can share with you. Basic things like setting up a nan's living room in the school. I don't know if you've had this in Ireland, where you literally have a room that, I don't know if that makes sense to everyone, nan's sitting room. It is an Irish thing, isn't it, as well as an English, and it's like a settee, and that just makes those parents feel a little bit less alienated by that school. It's choosing neutral venues. There's schools that do listening exercises where you actually listen properly to those parents. I'm terrible at this. Sit down and actually listen to what they have to say. So there's a whole skill set around this, and I think it needs professional training. It is about pay, but it's how you do it, you know. And I was just reflecting, sorry, I will shut up, on the individualism. You know, my children, because Siobhan's parents were over in London as well, of course, getting the jobs in London, typical Irish story. Siobhan's mum, Mary, looked after our children when they were younger. We had family. And that's kind of how it worked in the old days. And that has been lost a bit, hasn't it? Because we all live slightly individually. We all move from maybe where we're from originally. So in a way, government is having to think about replacing what was actually done by family. But anyway, those are just some reflections. It is how you do it that really matters, I think. One final thing, that another school I've seen done some amazing things where they've got people from the community to think about careers in the early years. So again, it's not just doesn't just become a professional middle class thing, that there are people from different communities going into that area.
Thank you. I don't know if anybody on the panel wants to respond to that, but can I take questions from the floor now? Did you want to come in? Laura.
Sorry, just a couple of points there that Lee is making. So some of those pieces you mentioned is absolutely kind of what's happening in our early years, and I know like all of our early years managers sitting there, and a lot of the work that takes place in our service is, I suppose, modelling and demonstrating for parents even the basics of how to wash your child, how to look after, how to prepare food. And they're probably things that we don't necessarily think is happening in early years, but is the work that happens because of the issues that we know families are presenting with. And despite all that, I think one challenge that I know from a service provision and an organisational point of view is that we often have, although we know it's the work that takes place in their early years and the work that people do is phenomenal work, it has become a more difficult sector to attract people to come into, and it's become a more difficult sector to retain staff in, which then creates challenges from us at an organisational kind of perspective, but also for children who are in our early years, if there's a bit of moving and kind of shaking from people coming and going. So it is one around salaries in terms of kind of how, you know, salaries that are paid to early years, but it's also around how do we kind of at a national level, how do we really value the role of early years providers and the staff who work in our early years services?
Thanks, Laura. I mean, I'll come to the floor now. I mean, I'm sure I've bored people saying this, but from our point of view, one of the reasons that we struggle with early year services, because I think that they're seen as services for parents rather than services for children. And if they were designed in the way that schools are to be for children, then I think that our focus would be different at budgetary times. Lots of questions over here. I have a question here, and if you could introduce yourself.
Hi, Bernie Laverty, National Manager for the ABC programmes in Trisla. And just to say, while we don't have Sure Start, we do have ABCs, but unfortunately only 12, so in terms of coverage. And that is obviously where the ABCs are working with the consortia, so with the early year settings, the schools, the other C&V sectors to join up kind of that local area-based approach. I know we're talking about early years education, but I just wanted to state as well around the home visiting and kind of working even before the early years is that we know there's really good evidence for having quality home learning or improving the quality of home learning in those areas that are most disadvantaged. So we used to think education started at primary school, now we've early years, and actually we should be putting money into the home learning environment as well and supporting parents from the word go. And we know one of the first 5 actions has been around the dedicated public health nurse for the under 5s. So I think if we can achieve that along with more targeted and universal access to home visiting, is kind of the first step, and then moving on to really good quality early year settings.
Thanks, Bernice. You don't have a question? No, that's fine. Yeah.
Mine
Thanks.
is just a comment as well. I'm Olive, I'm a Child and Family Centre Manager in Ballyfermot Star, work with Laura. Just wanted to add on to what Laura was saying, how important it is. Even parents, bringing it back down to basics. We often give parents food to bring home at weekends. Our food bill is shot up. I'm sure Laura will tell you about that. But parents often come in and ask us, how did you ask our chef, how did you make that? How did you make that food? They can't believe that their children are eating the food that they're eating. And we tell them how to make it. We give them the food for the weekends because we also know the food poverty that there is. And thanks to Tanya and the Children's Rights Alliance, that we've got great help around that. And we hope that continues. But just to know that, even as this lady said, sorry, about the home visiting, we take children from 3 months. So that involves another set of skills for the people, for the staff that work in the room, in the baby room. It's really, really young babies we have coming in, and the parents don't always have the skills for that. So we would like to branch out more on encouraging them to come in. We have parents coming in, visiting all the time. We've open door. We've a really, really good open door policy in our setting, and parents can come in anytime. They're invited in all the time. We include them in everything, days out, everything. But from that we've built up great relationships with parents, and the trust is there too, which is very important.
Thanks for that. Thanks for that addition. Did you have a question back here? No, not back here. Michelle here has a question. Thanks,
Thank
Michelle.
you. I suppose we've been hearing a lot about cultural capital there, about closing that gap, and Laura, you were talking about that as well. I suppose I'm thinking about it from a training point of view, and I was struck by something you said about building on that. And when I worked in a nursery school in Northern Ireland, we had children from disadvantaged backgrounds, and they may not have had the 3 million words that they had, that other children might have had, but they were problem solvers. They had good local knowledge, they were very resilient, and they found different ways of doing things. And I think we need to find a way to bring that into the curriculum, and in terms of that image of the child across the training point, because all those gaps that these people are talking about, the washing, the family support, all of that is trying to close that cultural capital space. But I don't think we talk about that in terms of that role of how people are doing that. So if you're looking at an inclusion coordinator, I think that's an important thing to look at across that space. And if we're reviewing any of the frameworks, I think that's an important thing to think about.
Yeah, you're talking my language now. So a lot of what I'm trying to do at the moment with the research is develop what we call strength-based approaches, which is essentially what you're saying. How do you address the deficits, which everyone's talking about now, which is totally important. I totally get where you're coming from. People do need those basics. But at the same time, and I'm sure the practitioners will be doing this, but I think we need a national framework. I'm talking about, I suppose, about England here, but you know, of celebrating and acknowledging those skills that those people bring. And teachers do this one, early years practice the best do this naturally, but I wonder whether there could be some more national sort of framework around this. So at the moment I'm trying to do a bit of research, is essentially quantifying from the research what are those things. And you're right, it's quick thinking, it's resilience, you have to be really careful not to be patronising about these things, right? But people, in my view, have strengths. It's just that they've had to adapt to the environments that they're in. So honestly, this is so crucial, what we would call a strength-based approach.
Yeah, so I'm going to take 2 more questions, and then I'm going to go back to the panel and ask them for some concluding remarks. This man here, if you could introduce yourself. Thanks a million.
Hi, I'm Mick Kenny. I'm a community childcare manager, and I've been working in areas of disadvantage for the last 29 years. I just feel really old. But I suppose it's to go back to a little bit what Tanya was saying, just on reflecting on where we were a couple of years ago. Like, my service where I am currently, I'm there 17 years, and it's a bit like what Lee was saying about breaking intergenerational poverty, because like I've met enough of I can't even call them children anymore because they're sort of in their late 20s, early 30s, and you can see the positive impact, you know, the work that we've had with them has made, and they will be quite open with you about that. And I even have one of my own staff who was one of my kids, who has actually gone on to PLC and actually has a degree in early years education, and she's a fantastic educator. You know, and it's like giving people that opportunity to step up. But like that, from a practical point of view, as being a manager of a service, I have to totally agree with Tanya around her comment around the system, you know, around it. We used to have an awful lot more flexibility under the old CCSP system, you know, currently with the NCS. And one of the concerns that we had even before it came out was the focus on work activation instead of being child-centred. And it has just got more difficult for us to reach out and support these families. And there's a little bit of a concern as well, like Equal Start, I have to say, is good. Because, say, the first 2 years of core funding, we would have operated at a deficit of 80 grand over the 2 years. Now, Equal Start has helped us break even, you know. But moving forward with the Equal Start, and this would be a question I would have, like, this time last year, I remember the ask was for 50 million to support Equal Start. And, like, with budget last year, there was all that billions of fantastic money coming into the Exchequer, and what we got was a fraction of that 50 million, you know. And at the time, it was a hot meal. But I know when it was announced there a few weeks ago, it's to support with the snack, a cold snack, you know, and that's for 38 weeks of the year. So, like, my hope would be, like, last year it was a giveaway budget. Like, this year, with everything that's going on globally, the coffers are going to be tighter. And I know, in fairness to the department, they are only starting to come work with what they get off of the government and off the Exchequer, and this would maybe come into a little bit around with the Department of the Taoiseach's office around getting behind the early years and early intervention. So, like, I suppose my question would be, coming up to this year's budget, if we got a fraction of 50 million last year, like, my expectations for this year, I live in optimism, I've lived in optimism for 29 years, but it does just seem to get harder. And, like, even there is that little bit of a fear of trying to protect the funding that we have for the children that we have. And there is, like, that work activation model element, but also there's the element of the way the NCS is funded on an hourly basis and attendance based. Because, like, when you're working with children coming from complex backgrounds, you know, their priorities can be different, and, like, we're working with them with the time that we see them. But if you're in fear of, like, a compliance visit, like where we lost 30,000 in 2019 because of under-attendance, there is a fear of that happening again. And I know as a manager it just gives stress. So I suppose from the Taoiseach's department and maybe from the department's point, and I know you can only fund what you get money for, but it's just, I suppose, realistically, what can we expect this year?
One question. I'm going to take the second question and then we'll go back to the panel.
Hi, my name is Pamela Wolfe and I work for the Daughters of Charity Child and Family Service. I manage 6 early years centres, and all of our centres are in areas that experience disadvantage. I was listening to Laura speaking there, and we would be very similar in that we provide huge wraparound services and support to parents. And just as an example of some of the things that we would do signposting, onward referrals, parent and toddler groups, applications, home visits, coffee mornings, bring parents on trips, advocate in relation to assessments and transitions to school. And we're also counsellors, and we provide toys and clothes and food in situations where it's needed. I just want to differentiate in childcare. There's 2 different types of childcare as I see it. There's childcare that provides care to children whose parents are working, but there's childcare which is more of a social care model, and that's kind of where we come from. And one of the things we were very excited about was the Equal Start, because we felt all our 6 centres would qualify, which they did, but only 2 centres qualified for Tier 1, and that one of them is in Mosney Accommodation Centre and one in Ballyfermot, so we're familiar with Ballyfermot. What we feel is that what we would like to do if we got more money from the Equal Start is to fund a dedicated family worker in all of our centres, because there's a huge need for it. And the staff on the floor, teachers, are not just teaching, they're supporting parents as our managers. We feel that the collection of data is not representing the families that we have with us. So, for example, 3 of our centres are in Dublin 8, and Dublin 8 is becoming a more affluent area in some ways, but it's also hugely disadvantaged. And some of the collection of data is air codes, and whether you have traveller or Roma children attending. But the air code does not show that while we might have had 10 children living in homeless accommodation hotels, we might have had 15 children who are living in grandparents' houses, in overcrowded houses, where there might be 7 or 8 children living under grandparents' houses where they have 2 bedrooms. So that's a huge issue for us. We also have a lot of immigrant families, and when we do our home visits, we find they're living in substandard accommodation, and those that are living in decent apartments are often subletting a 2nd bedroom, so you could have 2 families sharing 1 apartment so they can afford the rent. So this is something that we'd really like to see addressed, that the families that we're supporting are being recognised as living with disadvantage, and for our services to get more funding to support them.
Thank you very much. So, now I'm not going to try to summarise all of that, but we have a question about what's realistic in the budget. We have a question about maybe how Equal Start might expand to allow for a more family support role in particularly in Tier 1 services. Probably Tier 1 is most disadvantaged, Tier 2 and Tier 3. There are 3 tiers. I think that's right. Somebody will correct me. So there's those questions, but so maybe if I go to you, Liz, and then to Kieran, and then we'll move on to Laura and Tanya, maybe to make some concluding remarks. Okay? Yeah.
Thanks, Teresa. So I suppose in terms of the budget process, maybe if I explain a little bit of what we've been doing. So we have been working with all of the government departments, including Kieran's department, looking at what are the kinds of things that will have the greatest impact. And all of the government departments we have been working with have their own set now of data, some of the targeted measures they already do, maybe to expand them, or maybe some new measures. So we've been working very close with them through the network work, but over the course of the year, and then in sort of focused budget conversations about what is it they're going to put forward for their minister to prioritise in the context of the budget negotiations. And obviously we've briefed our own boss, the Taoiseach, on all of that, and we have had an opportunity to discuss in general terms at the Cabinet Committee about what we need to do this year. So we have been trying to get a focus in around what is the data telling us. So very much underpinning what, not just invest more in so many different places, and there's so much competition, but trying to really understand where we can say with some confidence that the data shows us these are the best things to invest in. So obviously early years is part of that, and there is a huge commitment to early years in government, and I suppose our focus has been on looking at the targeted end of it and that wraparound end of it. So they're really important. But the 2 other things I just want to mention, I mean, we've talked today, and you let it off really, that intergenerational disadvantage. I mean, that is really something we have to look into our hearts. We've been funding all sorts of special projects, programs for many, many, many decades at this stage, but there are still communities where we haven't cracked it. So I think we really have to challenge ourselves to say, are those models working? What's life like now? And when you come from a 3rd or 4th generation of a family dealing with maybe drug addiction, what's that like? It's different. It's not the same as the first generation. you know, where maybe the grannies were minding the children. The grannies now have also lived through those experiences. So I do think we really have to challenge ourselves, and we have to find ways of supporting the people who are doing the work on the ground to come up with, you know, newer models that we can have confidence in, that are locally tailored, because we know, and I think all of you maybe said it, or maybe Laura said it, that is where relationships are built between providers, and it's where trust is built with families. So I think that's also very important to us. And the other thing, which doesn't require necessarily money in the budget, is around that interagency piece. So we're doing a piece of work ourselves at the moment, trying to figure out how do you create the conditions for interagency working. And the way we've been looking at it, I mean, we do think there are professional barriers, so professional boundary barriers, and maybe some professional snobbery between professions. At a practitioner level, we have to give people the confidence, and also they're managing risks. So when you're sharing the care or decisions between services, that's kind of risky, so we have to think about that. And then obviously providers on the ground sometimes are competing with one another for investment and for services. So we're looking specifically at that as well, and that's not a big money piece, but what it does tell us is it's very difficult for people to move into those spaces if they're under-resourced. So in some areas we would feel that there is a need to just generally increase the funding to ensure that those community-based services have sufficient staffing to allow people to engage in that kind of practice. So they're the kind of things that are in our minds.
Thanks, Liz. Kieran?
Thank you. So I suppose just to kind of reiterate that for Equal Start, our real focus is to kind of facilitate services, you know, in delivering the quality, high quality services that we already know they deliver, but to acknowledge the additional requirements that are needed, I suppose, where there are services with the kind of the concentration of families living in disadvantage. And that, I suppose, is kind of through the consultations, through our discussion here, kind of the actual specific needs that are in those services that we're trying to, I suppose, address those, but to address those in a way that services themselves can be equipped to actually deal with those. One key factor on that will be the development of our family community partnership role. So that's something that's we're very keen on developing at the moment, and for next year as well. And a big consideration there is how a family community liaison or a family community partnership role within services will be, I suppose, how that'll interact with other interagency working that's already in place, and so that the earlier service again is facilitated to actually work within that system to try and get the best supports for the individual children and families. I think the mention of the additional nutrition program. So it's, I suppose, yes, it is. It's a snack for the preschool part of the day, and that is, I suppose, in a lot of the Equal Start Tier 1 and Tier 2 services, they're full-time services who have wraparound. And I suppose the piece on that is that a key focus as well is on the nutrition part and the nutrition education, and that's something that we're going to be rolling out as we go, and it's going to be a part that we're going to have a dietitian nutritionist who's going to be employed through Better Start to help services to actually engage kids in the process of you know, preparing the snack and then eating it and learning about, you know, different types of food and then putting it away in that, and that's, I suppose, you know, we're aware of the fact that there are services in Equal Start who are full-time and they're delivering hot meals and that. So look, this is one part of the jigsaw puzzle, and it's, you know, again, you know, this is kind of I suppose budget dependent as well in terms of what we can do there. On the budget, I suppose we can't preempt it, but I suppose just for Equal Start there is a very clear pathway for the actions that we want to deliver between now and 2028 under the 3 phases. I suppose for next year our real sort of goal is to embed sort of the funding that we already have, and also to develop the training and the CPD opportunities and the different, I suppose, resources that services can use so they actually can deliver on the services that they want to, and that's a key part. And then I suppose just to note that we have an ambition to fulfil all those actions as much as we possibly can. And then in terms of the identification model, so there's I suppose the dedicated identification model for Equal Start. Again, that'll be rerun in September 2026, so that'll be it'll go through sort of the iteration of the model. New services get put through the model as well when they're set up, and I suppose there was reference there, I think, to the sort of the different cohorts and that's something that we'll certainly be looking into in terms of are we hitting the right places there, because but we're looking at air codes of children, we're looking at the sort of whether living in IP accommodation or EROCs, homeless accommodation, the ethnic identifiers as well, whether people, this kind of a self sort of rating in terms of ethnic identifiers, and then the NCS subsidy. And I mentioned that sort of earlier on, just in terms of the looking at the NCS sponsor subsidy again, and whether how the department can actually try and I suppose utilise that. I in a previous iteration of my career, I did work in early years previously, and I was very familiar with the CCS at the time. This is like 11, 12 years ago. So I am aware of how flexible that was at that time. And I suppose, look, we're trying to think of the NCS as part of Equal Start as well, and that's why I was really keen to mention because this whole area is multifactorial, it's very complex. You have a whole load of different kind of bits and pieces that have to work together to try and deliver on what we want to deliver, and that's why I was really keen to mention, I suppose, core funding and NCS, and I suppose there's ECHE as well in the middle of all that, and that I suppose, and again, just to reiterate, our action plan going forward, we're looking to develop, we're working hard on developing an action plan so that we can deliver in the next couple of years on a system that does bring down the sort of the costs, but also is responsive to all what we know are the issues.
Thank you, Kieran. Moving on, Laura, any final remarks?
Yeah, just to say that the Equal Start funding for us has been a game changer in a lot of ways, in terms of just all those pieces that you outlined in terms of what it's been set up to do, that's been hugely beneficial to us. So I think enhancing that will be absolutely brilliant for us in Ballyfermot Star. The other couple of things, just to finish up on in terms of the NCS, like for us it would be great to see kind of if there was access to higher subsidies in terms of the NCS. Sometimes the parents who are in our service, we are a full-time service. Given the issues that I've outlined, we ideally want to have children in our care for full-time all day, but sometimes because parents aren't ready to go back to work, or they're not ready to maybe take up a QQI validated programme, often their plan of action is to maybe go into some type of addiction recovery treatment or rehabilitation, and that doesn't quite fit or meet the criteria. So maybe just trying to expand that would be kind of really helpful to us. And just, Liz, what you were saying around kind of that interagency work and that kind of operating within that community environment, again, I think in community-based services, we're really skilled at doing that. That's kind of what we do, that interagency work. And what will be really helpful for us, that again, we've kind of spent the morning talking about how the early years doesn't operate in, it's not siloed from all the other family work that we're doing, but often a challenge that we have is that because of the different types of services we provide, we've got multi-funding, and we're working with different funders, there's different requirements around that funding, and if there was some way of trying to coordinate or pull that together and make it a little bit more kind of seamless for us to be able to kind of be compliant and to respond, but so that we don't get caught up in overly with the administrative work, which takes us away from the work with the children and families.
I'd say there's people would sing that song for you, Laura, I'm sure, in the room. And Tanya, we'll let you have the last word.
I'm sure Lee has a few last words as well, but I just a few, I suppose, points. Just on the overcrowding piece, and it was George's the charity that actually brought that to our attention. We actually put it in the Child Poverty Monitor, which we published in June. When the team went to look at the data, they could actually see there had been a doubling in the numbers of overcrowded families. in a 3-year period. So we're like, so that's why the services are seeing this. So we have record numbers of homeless children, but we've record numbers of people living in overcrowded conditions. And they are two very dangerous drivers for outcomes for children. We already heard the data from Lee, and unfortunately, I think nearly the whole country is like London at this stage when it comes to the lack of affordable housing in Ireland at the moment. It's partly driven through, the recession and just a collapse in funding housing, but also, we're going through significant population growth as well, and the system is just not keeping up. I do think there's work that needs to be done looking at the impact of overcrowding on children today and children in homelessness. I think we can do a lot more for those families living in that situation. I had the consultant, Dr. paediatrician from the Health Service Executive meet with us 2 weeks ago, and she was talking about the high concentration of homeless accommodation in inner city Dublin and the lack of public health nurses and other services working with those families. So I think there's something there that needs to be dealt with. Going back to the funding issue, I think people were very disappointed, particularly working in targeted services in the budget last year, because what the government did, and it wasn't due to lack of work going on inside government, because you can hear already from Liz and Kieran the kind of thoughtful and considered work that actually goes on in trying to shape political decisions. But because we had a general election last year, the politicians favoured more the universal measures, and of course we got to see some real traction, like free school books, something that's a norm in most countries in Europe, and the expansion of the hot school meals programme. But that was at the expense of some of the targeted initiatives as well. So I'd be more hopeful this year, because if you listen to the mood music from the politicians, they are talking about targeted services. They're not talking about cost of living measures for everyone. They seem to be moving towards the targeted measures, and that has been helped, to be honest, by the statistics that have shown in a 1-year period an extra 47,000 children were in consistent poverty between 2023 and 2024, the deepest form of poverty. And obviously that helps people like Kieran and Liz behind closed doors when they're trying to advocate for funding the kind of targeted measures. But of course, we all have a role to play. Without a doubt, hearing the story that you do and the work you do is actually the most powerful story that motivates the politicians and the media and the public. And I have to say, we were delighted with the Red C poll that we commissioned earlier in August that showed huge public support for investing in targeted measures. I mean, it's extraordinary. And I'll tell you why it's significant. It's significant because when we did work back in 2017, 2018 with the Irish public on investing in poverty, we were getting very similar results to data from the UK at that time. When you ask people, why are children in poverty? What the public said is because they have bad parents. That's why. Parents are bad parents, they're making bad choices, and that's why they're in poverty. What's interesting in the last couple of years when we've done the polling, the public seem to understand the systematic nature of poverty, and it's actually not the fault of parents. It's because we're not putting the right structural measures in place to give everyone an equal chance and a chance to reach their full potential. And that's very encouraging, and that's something we should speak to the politicians about. And when we looked at the political parties, what was interesting was the two political parties that are in power at the moment, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, actually their voters overwhelmingly were in support of these measures. So that's very interesting, and that's something we have to echo back to our politicians if we need to get this over the line.
Thanks, Tanya. Lee, can we go to you for your final reflections or observations and advice, maybe?
Thank you very much. There's so much, honestly, going on in my head here. I think one thing, and I'm sure Liz has seen some of this stuff, in England we do have a debate about kind of returns on investment. I mean, I don't like the language that much, but it's the idea is that you invest to address poverty now, and it saves you so much in the future. It's very hard, isn't it, to argue this, because politicians are having to think about immediate budget decisions. And there are always caveats to some of the data, isn't there? There's always assumptions in the data, but I'm absolutely convinced, it seems to me, that if you invest to address them now, then in 20 years' time, you will be making savings. But I just wondered whether there was a debate. Maybe we can have that discussion over lunch about that, because I've seen that in other countries. The other thing that I'm getting a lot, so I'm in Wales later this week, then I'm in Scotland. I'm doing all the Celts. This is great. And the question, just for interest, both the Welsh and Scots are asking, I don't know the full answer to this question, what is disadvantage? I know it sounds like such a simple question, but I think one of the reflections on the debate we're having, I would argue it's multi-dimensional. So it's not just about income, it's about overcrowded in houses, it's about a number of things. And so I'm really interested that many governments are grappling with this issue. So the reason the Scots and Welsh and English are struggling with this is because free school meals has become more of a general entitlement in our schools. So you know, to what extent can you use that as a measure for targeted investment? So that's opened up a whole can of worms. But lots of different governments are grappling with that issue. How do we define disadvantage? On evaluation, one of the things as a former CEO of a charity, I would say, and I was really resonated with me with comments on this side, was evaluation needs to be both formative and summative, okay? So we found that when I was at the Sutton Trust that when we reported back to governments and funders, we had to sort of show that we were doing that everyone was turning up, that they were all having amazing outcomes. And in many ways, it would have been more, and I think you do have to have some of that, but in more ways it would have been a healthier relationship. They said, right, okay, why didn't people turn up? What lessons are you learning in the difficulty in all this? Because it's really difficult. And so I felt like we were always trying to tick the boxes, to be frank, to get the funding again, when in a way I would have loved to have had a longer term relationship, which we said, look, this is why we're struggling to get people to turn up to our sessions. You know what I mean? So I think there's a balancing act there, and I think governments, because they're so busy, tend to fall into what I would call summative assessment rather than formative. And as any good teacher will tell you, that formative is where you get the gains. Finally, I'd just like to say, you are doing some really good work here. Honestly, the fact, my understanding was there is an organisation that says child poverty in the government. There is, you know, I mean, honestly, for that to happen is a step in the right direction. I mean, I've been fighting this battle for years in England. So just to have that, and I know it's difficult, and I know we'd want, but honestly, and hearing some of the practice here, it fills me with optimism, I have to say, because you have to be an optimist, someone says, and that's right. And despite all the challenges that I showed you earlier, we have to be optimistic. And so honestly, I've heard some really good things today. So thank you for all you're doing.
Thank you. So that brings us to an end of our morning. It falls to me to do some thanks and tell you what's going to happen next. Thank you to our audience for your attention, for your questions, and thank you to everybody who's been joining us online. In particular, obviously, I'd like to thank our keynote speaker, Lee, and for all your observations, which I think will be, I think we all were listening very carefully to all of your advice and your commentary. Our panellists, thank you for your insights and your time today, to Liz, to Kieran, to Laura and to Tanya, and again to the YMCA for hosting us. As you will probably know, today is the first in a series of events for a week-long End Child Poverty Week, and if you use the hashtag End Child Poverty Week, you'll see what's going on. Back to that mosaic of funding. For today's event, we have to give thanks to the Community Foundation, the Fidelis Foundation and the Catherine Howard Foundation, whose invaluable support was instrumental to the week and to the ongoing End Child Poverty campaign. And I think on all of our behalf, I'd like to thank Tanya and the whole Alliance team for their tireless work to ensure that the End Child Poverty Week makes child poverty a political priority, always, and just particularly at the moment in the run-up to the budget. So get onto your hashtag. Please join us for some lunch. There's lunch over here. We'd love people to stay around and have those discussions, continue those conversations. And the team in the Alliance will be in touch with all of the attendees. We'll send Lee's slides, which he's kindly agreed to allow us to send out. And I'm sure we'll all like to to look at the finer print. So have a good rest of day. Please stay and have some lunch. And thanks everybody for your participation this morning.